everybody, and welcome to another episode of the Wild, Wise and Worthy podcast with myself, Kelly Ray. And today I've got Dave Hompez co-hosting with me. And our guest today is Dr. John Hunter from South Africa. So before we get into our conversation, I'm just going to read out a little notice waiver. So the conversations shared in this episode arise from personal experience, perception, and independent research. Any references to events, environments, organizations, teachings, or practices are offered for psychoeducational and informational purposes. They represent reflections on patterns that appear in high demand or high pressure systems and are not descriptions of the actions or intentions of any identifiable individual. Neither I nor my guests make factual claims about any named person. Nothing shared in this episode is intended to malign, defame, or harm the reputation of any individual or organization. Where we speak about coercion, control, harm, psychological pressure, or group dynamics, these reflections relate to lived experience and the interpretation of recognized research in psychology, neuroscience, trauma studies, and cultic studies. The discussion is not presented as legal, professional, medical, or psychological advice. The views expressed are our own, drawn from personal experience, perception, and study, and are offered in the public interest to support education, awareness, and informed understanding. So, thank you. So I'm going to let my guest today, Dr. John Hunter, introduce himself. But first of all, I want to say I had a brief conversation with John probably about a month ago, just reached out because I had read part of his thesis and listened to a few podcasts that he was talking about large group awareness trainings and the effect that dopamine has on the people that are attending those. And it was really something that I recognized immediately, the pattern that affected myself in attending large group awareness trainings. So I'm just going to let him introduce himself. So welcome, John, and thank you for being on my podcast.
Hi, how you doing? Yeah, a bit of background. I started studying LGATs or large group awareness trainings in 2010 after I took part in one myself through work, which is quite a common way for people to get involved in them. It's quite common that an employer might encourage their staff to take part in a seminar, and that's how I actually got involved myself. So after taking part, I was quite disturbed by what I was seeing, and I just started looking into them. That led to me going back to university in 2013 to study psychology. I completed an undergrad in psychology, then honors, then masters. My masters focused on large group awareness trainings. And then I completed a PhD at the University of KwaZulu-Natal, which is on the east coast of South Africa. And the focus of my PhD was, again, LGATs. And I think what I think is maybe interesting or useful about that is that since the early 90s, there hasn't been a lot of formal research on these seminars. They tend to be quite litigious. Academics tend to have avoided looking at them. So my research was the first to have really tried to make sense of them in quite a while. So, yeah, that's, I suppose, the background.
The short version. And I just also would like to welcome Dave, who's going to join me co-hosting. Dave, do you just want to give a little bit of introduction of why you're here and who you are?
Yeah, sure. I've been involved with two LGATs over the years, starting in about 2000. And when I read John's book, upon your recommendation, I realized that the patterns were certainly applicable to me. Not necessarily extreme. Yep, there's the book. And that got me really interested. And so I have a background in physiology, sports science, nutrition, functional medicine, and then doing my own research on neuroscience and cognitive science in particular. And putting the pieces together, there wasn't much of John's book that I would have disagreed with. It's kind of from bits and pieces that I'd come across already, and he pulled them together really nicely. And I think we really need to get this info out to people because I think there's a lot of misdirection in these LGATs that we want to put straight.
Yeah, I have to agree with that. And I just flash this here. This is John's book if anyone's interested in it. We normally do this at the end, but I'll do it at the beginning. But it is definitely something that after reading it myself and listening to a lot of podcasts with yourself, John, and I'm about 3/4 of the way through your thesis, which is Really did. It was really interesting for me because it really resonated to me in my lived experience inside of the organization that I was part of for so many years. And what I noticed in it was that we were trained to stay like in a continual rhythm of like challenge and collapse, right? Like first the pressure of the cognitive reframing process that we used. Then we had like a sense of a breakthrough, and then the next challenge would come up. And so I fell into that pattern, like as it become habitual for me to fall into that pattern. And I noticed others, Dave was also part of the same organization. He can speak for himself, but I noticed others that I was directly associated with too fell into the same habitual pattern. And I also experienced it for myself that I believe that it shaped the way that I thought and behaved. So over time, I felt like I lost like my natural stress response, and my decisions depended on the next internal breakthrough or the next process for me to be able to make decisions. And I saw that also happening to a lot of people that were fairly close to me. And your research gave me language for the repeated stress and the sudden relief. So, I just want to thank you for that because it was something that I was really searching for. And what I realize now, what I've come to understand is that the state was created by the dopamine surge, which feels like clarity. And for myself, I was chasing that because I was looking for certainty in any questions that I had, any challenges that were coming up. It was just habitual patternicity straight back into the cognitive reframing process. And so today I'd really love to explore how this pattern alters like our neural circuits and entrenches habit loops and influences identity. And really also too, I noticed the factor that moral reasoning was inhibited in some way. So can we explore moral reasoning, how that influenced that over time too as well?
Sure. I mean, and I really enjoy praise as much as anyone else, but I also would like to kind of put in a caveat with the explanation that I've put forward. It's very much a theory. It's a kind of way of trying to make sense of the experience, and it is quite simplistic. So I think any neuroscientist would look and kind of go, well, that's probably one element of what's going on, the dopamine element, but there's so many things going on in your brain and so many social things and other things that are interacting that it makes it very difficult to kind of simplify it entirely like that. I also think that when you contacted me and asked me about certain things, my research is very much focused on that kind of breakthrough state, and that feels very much like hypomania and mania, and we can talk a little bit about that, the sort of bipolar disorder link that's very relevant to me, and it's kind of what helped me to recognize it is because I was diagnosed with bipolar disorder in 2003, and so I was very interested in that transformational state where there's that euphoria and confidence and energy and motivation and a sense of productivity and optimism and that sort of thing. But the questions that you asked were more along the lines of, what are the long-term effects of this, and how can this maybe lead to these sorts of behaviors longer term? And I think that the more you move away from the short term issue, the more speculative it becomes. So while we can create some possible explanations, we've also got to be very cautious. The longer term something is, the more confounding variables come and the more other things are interacting. So it does make it quite difficult to be like, well, that's definitely the thing that's happening. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. No, that makes sense. Inside of that, maybe we can kind of pre-contextualize my audience to what a LGAT is. And in your book, you mentioned 3 environmental triggers for hypomania, and speak a little bit to that and how we see those playing out inside of the LGATs.
Sure. So, I mean, if we're not going to speak about organizations in particular, the sort of very prominent LGATs that became popular really came about from about 1971 onwards. And there were some other organizations before that were sort of similar in a number of ways, but they really became popular in the 1970s, and some of them are very much still around today. Typically, they last over seminars. They run over usually 3 to 5 days. That's how they often look, and they involve, I would say, emotionally intense exercises that I would describe as psychologically stressful and in many cases psychologically abusive, interspersed with relaxation exercises, guided visualization exercises, that sort of thing. There's often quite an emphasis on sharing. So people sharing personal experiences in front of a group of people. There's often a high emphasis on accepting responsibility. And that's kind of positioned as an empowering thing, but often the way that it takes place could reasonably be described as causing guilt and shame and that sort of thing in the people in question. So that sort of very high stress, an abnormal level of stress and often sleep disruption typically takes place over the first 75-80% of the seminar. And then usually on the final day, the stress is removed and it's replaced with a sense of, freedom, love, you've graduated, you're now one of us, that kind of thing. So there's that switch between oppression and then a sense of almost forgiveness, which is my book kind of looks at it from a religious lens, but that pattern of you are inadequate, you're not good enough, focus on all of your flaws, and then here's a solution to that, and basically a kind of graduation. And the characteristic of LGATs that I would say is almost key is that they are offering experiential learning. So they're offering some sort of transformation that can't really be put into principles very easily. So it's almost like the learning comes from something internal and automatic as opposed to traditional learning where you kind of learning ideas and then cognitively processing them and that sort of thing. So it's almost a shift in the way that you see yourself, the way that you see the world. And typically, but it seems like about 70 to 80% of people that go through this process are pushed into the state of euphoria, confidence, energy, motivation, whatever that's called, a transformation in the context of many of these seminars, or a breakthrough or something like that. And I'd say that that's the key sort of characteristic of these seminars. The other thing that you notice with them over the last 50 years is that there have been claims of negative effects on some participants. So the majority seem to experience this euphoria and then kind of come back down to normal. But there have been consistent claims of psychosis and people experiencing depression afterwards, mood instability. So people kind of feeling very up and then down and they're sort of all over the place. And yeah, I would say that those are some of the key characteristics of these seminars.
There was also a part in there that I mentioned, reading the book about goal attainment, which relates to stress removal.
Sure.
What would the likelihood of some of those things? Because the majority of people think, oh, like I've got my 5-day goals, short-term, medium goals. But would it be nested or could it be nested within the methodology or the reframing process as well?
Yeah, I mean, and correct me if I'm wrong, if I'm not answering this correctly. So what I noticed in the LGAT, based on my experience and understanding of bipolar disorder, that the seminars incorporate established triggers of hypomania and mania, which are these elevated states of bipolar disorder. And 3 of these triggers are psychological stress, which you clearly see in these seminars, sleep disruption, which you clearly see in a lot of these seminars, and goal attainment, which is reaching some sort of goal. And as you mentioned, it can be the removal of stress. So often when you are striving towards a goal, there's stress involved in getting there, and then you get there, and then the stress is basically removed. So there's kind of the sense of relief. And when I was taking part in one of these seminars, I just thought to myself, there couldn't be a clearer example of these 3 major triggers being packed very intensely into this format.
How did you notice that, like in the seminar that you went to? What was the format that they had?
Well, I mean, we arrived, and I mean, again, there's some common things in the LGATs that are based on the original LGATs from the sort of 70s. Things like not telling anyone about what goes on in them is a big thing. So you're not allowed to reveal any information about what's about to take place. And that adds to the stress because there's uncertainty. You're not really sure of what's about to happen. But we were effectively told, listen, you go to the seminar, we can't tell you anything about it, but we guarantee that you'll have the greatest day of your life on the final day, which to me was a very big claim, having been manic before. That is essentially the best you can feel. So that was strange to me. And before I took place, I'd heard from people in the office that people had been divorced, like quite a high number of people had come out of the seminars and got divorced immediately afterwards in a pretty big organization. But the fact that had been noticed was kind of interesting to me, but I still hadn't made that connection. But I got into the seminar. We started at 6 o'clock on a Thursday evening. So we'd worked a full day, like 8 till 5 or maybe 4:30. That let us out a little bit early, and we'd got to the seminar. It started at 6 and it ended at 2 in the morning. So very long hours. They gave us homework on top of that. So sleep was disrupted. And the person running the seminar I just thought he was highly abusive. He was screaming at people. He was shouting at people. There was a huge amount of stress in the room. People were sharing things about themselves that were quite traumatic and quite hard to listen to. And his attitude was very much responsible for the way that you've experienced these things. So essentially, it's kind of your fault if you are experiencing the events like this. And it didn't really matter what it was. That's kind of the attitude that he would take. And so over the first 3 days, I was noticing this high level of stress. And as somebody that was trying to avoid a relapse in terms of my own mental health condition, I was very aware that this was not a good environment for me to be in. Then as somebody that monitors my sleep very carefully as well, I'll generally be in bed asleep by 10 o'clock at night. And now it was 2 in the morning and I had homework that I had to kind of complete. That was something that I noticed as well. And then on the final day, suddenly this trainer who's been basically abusive for previous 3 days is now hugging everyone. He's come down off the stage. Now, he basically says, you're the same as me now. We're all on the same level. And initially he was kind of positioning himself as very much like a godlike figure. And so suddenly we're all on the same level and people are dancing and smiling and, they're just absolutely euphoric. So I'm looking around the room and I'm going, okay, we've got stress, we've got sleep disruption, we've got goal attainment or social reward at the end. And all of these people are now looking like they're in a hypermanic state. Like everything about what they were doing and saying to me resembled a person with bipolar disorder who's in these elevated states. And then I started thinking back on these stories of people getting divorced. And impulsivity is a common feature of mania as well. So making these very big decisions is something that people that are manic often do. And that aligned with divorce. So I ended up leaving this organization after meeting with the chairman and telling him that I didn't really agree with his courses. And I started looking into these seminars online. And then people describe their experiences of these seminars and they describe how they felt afterwards. And regardless of whether the seminar was in Bulgaria or Hong Kong or Australia or North America or, various parts of Europe, they're all describing the same pattern and very often identical exercises. So I'll mention LifeSpring. They're not around anymore, but LifeSpring was one of the big LGATs from the 1970s, 80s, and they don't officially exist anymore, but you just see their exercises identical being used in all of these seminars all around the world, and none of them claiming an association with LifeSpring. So everyone kind of says, I've come up with this thing on my own. It's my own technology. I'm the person who developed it, but they're very much doing the same thing. So what I saw in people's descriptions was the same process. Then you see the same results: euphoria, energy, motivation, optimism, decisiveness, impulsivity. And then sporadically, you see these accounts of psychosis, these claims of suicide, that kind of thing. And as a result of that, that's basically what my PhD explains. It kind of goes, okay, here's evidence from 100 sources that show that this pattern exists in these seminars and that these results consistently appear in these seminars. And effectively that the pattern corresponds with established triggers of bipolar disorder, hypomania and mania, and that the symptoms of hypomania and mania look identical to what's called transformation in these seminars, including psychosis, which occurs at the extreme of mania and occasionally depression. So there was just like a very clear overlap between what I was seeing in bipolar disorder and what you start seeing in these seminars.
The thing that springs to mind here is that at each of these organizations, there's an internal explanation of why you are experiencing these states and what is happening. At the
Yeah,
one Callie and I was at, it was a very mystical explanation based on mysticism from way back 3,000 years ago, all the way through to now. But the previous one that I was at, um, they were using more NLP style techniques there, and they're never really trying to explain what's going on. You're just having the experiences. What you're saying is that there may well be a mechanistic explanation that really
exactly.
explains and describes those states that people reach without the need for any fancy philosophizing or mystification of the experience. Having tracked what happened in the initial LGAT that I was involved with, I can share with you that I know at least 6 couples who were divorced after being
Yeah,
involved with that group. I know people who made very impulsive decisions. There were unplanned pregnancies as well. There were people who
yeah,
nearly lost their businesses or did lose their businesses. I don't know anybody who ended up in psychosis, but certainly there was a lot of friction within people who had quite stable lives prior to that.
yeah,
And the exercises in that first one were very much tough, stressful exercise followed by a release. Tough, stressful exercise followed by a release for 3 straight days on the initial free introductory course, getting you
yeah,
into that manic state and then constantly upselling thousands of pounds worth of additional programs because you're now in that open, impulsive state. And you have people running to the back of the room to spend 7,000-8,000 pounds because they're in that state. And then they have a very small cool off period where you can get a refund. And then you're locked in. You end up having to go to
yeah,
the owner. The second one was more a mystical thing. And there's one huge long exercise on the Saturday afternoon, which is made more stressful in certain ways by the seminar leader, that ends with one big, huge, let's call it a mystical experience. But now that seems to be much more to me to be a dopamine, oxytocin, endorphin, serotonin
yeah,
flood of the nervous system, which creates that mystical feeling, that mystical experience that I think Patrick McNamara talks about, a neuroscientist who you mentioned in your book.
yeah.
And so my feeling now is that if we have a mechanistic explanation, we want to be falling back on that first before we start to draw any fancy conclusions that anything mystical is happening. And so that would be my sort of input from that initial 10 minutes or so.
Yeah, and I mean, I think that the tricky thing is that I also I don't like, I'm cautious of saying to people, this experience didn't have any meaning and you kind of can't create meaning around it. And I mean, the same thing when I'm commenting on religious experiences in the book. These things can be hugely powerful for people, and that they can be catalysts for some sort of change in your life, and you can do some incredible things. But I think that the problem comes is that a lot of the people running these organizations are using them to exploit people. And so then it does become useful to kind of say, well, this is maybe actually, as you say, a kind of mechanistic explanation for what's going on. I think it's kind of like when if you look around the world, there's things called imagistic rituals. So like people that are doing fire walking, and there's various Hindu groups that do exercises where they attaching hooks to their bodies and they're walking on spikes, and they're putting themselves through pain, and then they have these powerful experiences afterwards. In the same way, things like ayahuasca and psilocybin and peyote and whatever have been found independently of each other. So people have found these plants and they've, taken them, and they've realized that they elicit these experiences, and then an explanation for those experiences are kind of built around them. And I think that that's very much what's happened with LGATs. At the time that they came about, the neuroscientific understanding didn't exist. So I think they've stumbled upon these processes and then kind of said, okay, well, this is very powerful. It's very positive. And if you're a salesperson and you can package and sell it, then let's do that. And if you look at it, all the people that started these organizations, they all had backgrounds in sales, not in neuroscience, not in psychology. And so you can kind of see how these things have come about. And I also just think that it's very tempting if you are a particular sort of person, if you can offer this mystical thing to people and associate yourself with it, and you can be seen as some sort of god, which is what a lot of these people running these organizations tend to do. It must be very tempting to do that. And so I can understand why nobody that's involved in them would want to look at it and kind of go, okay, it's just my brain responding to an extreme circumstance. It felt amazing. It felt like my life had changed, but actually it's just this other thing. But to be fair, that's kind of what happens with bipolar disorder. You have this experience and you think, oh my God, my life has changed. Everything's incredible. I've got this insight into the universe that nobody else has, and it lasts for a certain period of time. And then you kind of come down from it and you're forced to reckon with the other option, which is that, it could just be something going on in your.
Yeah, and my thought is that we shouldn't throw out the idea of mysticism, but if we have a mechanistic pathway, we want to explore that first, or at least not ignore it. And I'm also
Yeah.
with you on the fact that Kelly and I wouldn't have stayed in the organization for so long if we didn't feel we were getting some benefit from it to start with as well. But then
Yeah.
over time, a little bit like a sort of a bipolar roller coaster, some people do end up dropping back down into the ditch from being up on the mountain peak, or they start to lose a sense of self, and things don't quite feel right. I mean, that was my experience since probably 2019, that there's something not quite right, that I dragged around with me for 5 years until this year, and started to figure it all out. And the other thing is with the one that we were in, there's a very strong emphasis on complementary opposites as being an orienting or a structuring principle by which the universe is organized. And we know that from physiology, there are lots of complementary opposite functions that keep everything in homeostasis. And we need both. But with this organization, we're taught to accept both sides, but not the method being used, which is only good. There can't be any downside to it. It can only bring benefit and reward. And if you are not experiencing that, it means either you're not doing the work properly or you're not clever enough to understand how to do it. But there's absolutely
Yeah.
nothing wrong with the work. And I think that seems to be, again, another theme of all the LGATs, where it goes back to your point of they all tell you that you are responsible for everything. But actually, you may
Yeah.
be exposed to these psychotechnologies that without any informed consent, you don't really know what you're getting yourself in for.
Yeah.
They are very powerfully affecting the brain and the nervous system. And actually, the outcomes are not guaranteed to be all positive, but you're never made aware of any of that. And because you're in these manic states, you never think to stop and go, oh, well, apart from you, of course, John, because of the previous bipolar, you're not really thinking, oh, I must go and investigate what's going on in my brain. You're just flying with it in the same way that you would be if you have taken psilocybin or even MDMA or whatever. So it's dubious from that perspective, in my opinion.
Yeah. I mean, I think not only are you not made aware of the fact that some people don't respond well to it, but my research reveals that it's deliberately withheld. So the information provided by some of the organizations, they clearly understate the chances of harm occurring. They make very explicit claims about this is the percentage of people that might be negatively affected, and it's based on no research. So, I mean, I don't know where they're getting that information from. And then you also you start recognizing that when people are harmed, um, the pattern seems to be that if a person is harmed and they sue the organization, the response is typically that it's settled out of court and that the person in question has to sign a waiver or disclaimer basically saying that they're not going to talk about it, which prevents other people from hearing about it. And then the other thing there is that the people that are harmed psychologically, very few of those people have got the financial resources or the psychological strength at that time to do something about it. So you're seeing such a small fraction of people that actually end up suing the organizations. And of those people, the ones that you end up hearing about is even a smaller percentage. So you aren't able to make that the informed consent's not really there. And I think that that's an issue. The other thing that you mentioned is that the idea that the problem's always with you. It's never with the technology. And Robert J. Lifton, who was, the psychiatrist who wrote the book Thought Reform and the Psychology of Totalism in 1961. So this was looking into brainwashing or thought reform during the Korean War. And he came up with these conditions of thought reform. And one of them was the sacred science. And this is the idea is that the technology or the processes are always perfect. They can't be questioned at all. It's always if there's something goes wrong, it's always the individual that's at fault. It's never the technology. It can't be questioned. It's also kind of like mystical in its nature, that the technology. So it often can't be explained. And that's where we kind of come back to the fact that they won't look at a mechanistic explanation. They'll kind of say it's with you said complementary opposites or whatever, there's always kind of this magical system that, only the founder really can kind of truly get, and you just need to accept it and not question it and try to apply it as best as you can.
I think you mentioned this language. They're happy to count all their hits and share all the positive experiences.
Yeah.
But the misses are just swept under the mat and nobody's allowed to talk about them. And if they do come up, it's because the person has not done the work adequately or hasn't done enough of it.
Yeah.
That goes entirely. We think about what's happening with the hypocrisy, which is they're telling you to be responsible for your life and accountable, but then they will not take accountability or responsibility for anything they do.
Exactly. Yeah.
And remember, Dave, in the environment that we were in, the reframing technique was also based on cause and effect, and also the laws of reflection and transparency to look at where whatever you're seeing on the outside is something that you're repressing on the inside. So that also kept you in check too as well, in a way. And there's so many other aspects, like listening to you both talk around. I'm just going to bring you back to John with the element of people making bad decisions in these, coming out of these experiences, getting divorced as such. We could say, well, from my experience, is that the bad decisions weren't getting divorced, they were actually staying in bad relationships because they were justified with the certain reframing process as such to come to a space of unconditional love for that person, and then using the laws of reflection and transparency. Where have I done that to own that particular action, trait, or inaction that that person is experiencing? And so again, you can see, I feel that again is like, you're responsible. That's a causal thing, because you haven't taken ownership for that. So therefore you're getting it on the outside to show you the reflection on the inside. And that in itself could be
And I mean,
deemed as abstract and very hard to decipher.
Yeah, and I mean, I think also the idea that any action can just be reframed as actually this was a good thing. Therefore, the results of the seminar or the process or the technology were good becomes an issue. And again, Robert J. Lifton spoke about doctrine over person as one of the 8 conditions of thought reform. And the idea there is that the interpretation posed by the environment or by the leader of the environment supersedes the person's own experience, etc. So, I mean, there's a great example from an undercover documentary on one of the organizations that's still around. And one of the women in the seminar is saying to the leader, I'm being harassed by people to join up for the next seminar. They're calling me 3-4 times a week there, and I've told them not to. And the seminar leader says, are you being harassed? And she says, I definitely think I am. And he says, well, maybe they're supporting you. They're supporting you. They want the best for you. So you're interpreting it as being harassed, but actually they're supporting you. And so the framing of the environment, just squashes the interpretation of the person in question. And so even a negative event can be framed as something positive. So certainly I think that that's something that can go on. Yeah.
Well, in my experience too as well, that was definitely used in our organization, of reframing the positive into a negative and the negative into a positive. It was quite complex, Dave, wasn't it? To be able to get your head around a notion of it. It was taught to us that we were coming back to a state of balance. So the aspect of thinking that we were creating bipolar states was not even in our mind, not even in our teaching, because if we were up, we brought ourselves down. If we were down, we brought ourselves up. So we came to this place of equilibrium, it was known as. And in the languaging, in the teachings, there was, how would you say it? There was a lot of moving away from anything to do with depression in a different way. We didn't believe that we were depressed. I actually thought, in my, from my experience, that we had this great tool that could bring us to a state of love and gratitude and certainty and presence and enthusiasm with a state of inspiration at any given moment. So that was kind of the go-to thing. Anytime I had stress in my life or experienced challenge, it was just cognitive reframe, and bringing your place back to here. But after listening and reading, and really my experience was having what I can only attest to was a full nervous system breakdown relative to, because I feel like my cup was so full, there was nowhere to go in my nervous system, and had nothing left because I was just continually using this. So it's like I'd become addicted to the process, but nature within itself was saying, no, that is not what we are designed for.
Yeah. Yeah, I think the whole idea of the sense of self as well is so important. I read the textbook, the Handbook of Self and Identity, and there's a chapter in there by a neuroscientist from University of California. I think it's Santa Barbara, and his name's Stanley Klein, and he lists 7 or 8 bullet points as to neurocognitively what the requirements are for a sense of self, or how a sense of self is constructed through time. And so it's things like your semantic understanding of your traits and other people's traits, semantic understanding of how the world works, self, other, the world, and the relations between them, episodic memories, emotions, etc. And when I look at the tech that we were using in this group, it attacks all of those. Like the fundamental rationale behind using that psychotechnology is to get in there and attack all the key aspects of forming a sense of self. And so it's not surprising when you are aggressively working through those questions and through those steps that your sense of self is at risk of being, I wouldn't say decimated is the right word, but certainly compromised. And again, in ways that you're not signing up for. And the other irony is, of course, that we were told to integrate our positive and negative perceptions and bring ourselves or other people down from pedestals or up from the pit, as it was termed, which sounds very much like Adler's idea of creating horizontal relationships rather than vertical relationships. But then the outcome of that, looking at your work, John, is to end up in a state of mania, which is the precise opposite of what you're being told you're doing. You're actually being told you are equilibrating your perceptions and coming to a point of equilibrium or integration, when in actual fact, that end state is about as manic as it can get. So the contradiction there is just dumbfounding. So when I read that, I was just like, wow, because it's the opposite of what you're being told you're achieving.
Yeah, I mean, and it seems like the explanation in the organization that you were in is not necessarily the same as what you would find in all other organizations. But something that you said there resonated. In one of the early articles, I think from like the early 90s, they speak about LGATs, and they say that it can be boiled down to a premeditated attack on the self. So that's how it was described, 30 odd years ago, is that's basically what's going on. And so there are elements of kind of inducing guilt, which is kind of based on things that you've done, but it seems a lot more of it can kind of focus on shame, which is more on who you are. And that's the attack on the self. So like who you are as a person and whatever, that's being kind of constantly questioned, and it's positioned as a way of kind of, let's just have a look at yourself. But often it can have that insidious effect of making you feel quite uncertain about who you are. In terms of, I mean, when you got hold of me, you spoke to me about that kind of eroding of self over time. And so I looked into it briefly, and this is not a core area of what I've researched before, but that constant stress is going to lead to chronic chronic stress has been shown to have negative impact on parts of your brain, like the the medial prefrontal cortex, for example, which has got a lot to do with storing of autobiographical information, which is basically like who you are and that sort of thing. So there is some like neuroscientific theory that can explain why long-term exposure to stress, aside from the fact the cognitive side that you mentioned, Dave, that you may just start having a bit of an erosion of some of that sense of who you are.
So if let's just say could repeated cycles of stress, say because of the conditioning, and then using the habitual of using the cognitive reprocessing method that we had, which we are generally creating new cycles of stress because in our world we had equilibrated the last stress and therefore we had come into the next quantum sphere of the next void, which is a form of stress. But if it was related to something that was relative to our mission and vision, which is goal attainment linked into that, then it was classified as eustress because we would be able to cope and do that. But I can see now that it also had still the elements of stress in there. And so I guess what I'm asking, could repeated cycles of stress and sudden relief by using methodology desensitize our reward system, leading to what I call the blunted affect, which I think what Dave's saying too is to lose a sense of self. And for myself, it was like I felt emotionally flat coming to this place of nothingness.
Yeah, I mean, so the the theory can kind of explain two possibilities, and I mean, there's always like such a nuance to this. So the one possibility is something that's referred to as incentive sensitization theory. So that's the idea that repeated rewards can actually make you more sensitive to rewards. And you often see that with addictive behaviors, is that people start becoming very sensitive to any cue that predicts getting the reward that they've had. So a gambler, if they see a bright light while they're driving around, that might remind them of the casino, and then that makes them want to go and do that or whatever. So there can be a sensitization. But if you think about the idea of tolerance within addiction and the dopamine system, the more you take a particular addictive substance, often the more you need in order to achieve the same reward. So a sort of flooding or too frequent, if you get the reward too frequently, then that system can become desensitized and you need more reward in order to get it. So you see that with drug addiction, you see that with sex addiction, porn addiction, those sorts of things, and people needing more drugs or more extreme porn or more of whatever the thing is in order to get the same result as before. And you know, again, in the addiction literature, and it differs from person to person, often some sort of abstinence from engagement can lead to that sensitization kind of coming back. It seems to depend on the individual, but also on how long it's been done for in terms of whether that sensitization comes back. I mean, you might have heard of dopamine detoxing, which is not, I don't know if it's a particularly academic term, but if you are constantly on your phone, constantly getting these sort of short-term rewards, it can make you feel sort of unmotivated and lack of energy and whatever because that system has been overloaded for a while.
So in essence, in the teachings that we were part of, it was taught to myself. You can speak for yourself, Dave, but it was taught to myself, and the way that I understand it is we were in attainment of mastery. And again, I can now see that that's a goal attainment. And we were taught that for the master, everything serves, and for every greater level of completion or integration, the master gets to get a greater level of challenges to be able to integrate, to get to the
Grow.
element of transcendence is placed in there. And so inside, then it was that constant state of, well, I'm just growing and I'm getting greater levels of challenges to be able to get to that greater level of growth and transcendence. Can you explain? I'm very interested in the neuroscience that actually is happening with that. And from your thesis and from the book, it also says that in essence, it's pushing us deeper into the limbic system. And from my remembrance in what I was taught is that we were going higher and higher into the higher mind, the prefrontal cortex, where we have critical thought and are able to have objective thinking. So now I have come to experience that that is not what was happening.
Yeah, I mean, I don't know if I can comment with much insights on exactly what was going on there. I would say that, based on our previous conversation, the sort of long-term effect of being involved in these sorts of seminars is that the prefrontal cortex, which has kind of got to do with regulation, is going to be taken more and more offline. And if there is a sort of sensitization of the reward system, which is quite possible, then that's going to become more powerful. So if you think of the kind of brain as having one part that's sort of like almost like an automatic drive to get things done, and another part, which is the prefrontal cortex, kind of keeping that in check. If this part starts getting more powerful and this part starts getting less powerful, then your ability to reflect starts getting less and less over time, and your behavior will become more automatic and less deliberate. I would say that that's the part from having looked into it based on our conversation that I could comment on, but the rest is maybe beyond me.
So would you say that it has an impact on our decision-making process then because of
Well, yeah, I mean, it seems like it certainly is going to do that, and as Dave was speaking about before, there's the cognitive element. So you're kind of being taught ways to think about things that, even if you forget about the neuroscience entirely, there's a way of reframing, there's a way of thinking about things that's being spoken to you, and then in parallel with that, you've got things that may be going on from a neuroscience perspective that are working at the same time as that different way of thinking. So it's almost like if you think about the way that a psychiatrist and a psychologist might approach depression. So the psychiatrist might give you an SSRI, and that's going to change something neurochemically. And a psychologist coming from a cognitive perspective is going to say, well, if you think about things in these ways, and if you change these automatic thoughts that you've got, that may have a positive effect on you. And both of them are going to hopefully improve mood. And so I would say that that's a nice metaphor, perhaps, in terms of what's going on in terms of LGATs, is that there's a cognitive element. So you're kind of getting programmed or taught to think in a particular way. And there's quite extreme stuff going on in terms of brain chemistry, in terms of creating these highs and these lows, and there's a huge amount of stress and it's being removed. So those things are happening at the same time.
I think there are a couple of really important things there. One of them is this emphasis at the particular seminars we were at is that the whole goal of the seminars is to get you to function more from your executive center. Yet right from the word go, that seminar is designed to do the opposite. And so the initial 5 hours on the sort of signature program is a very educational 5 hours. There's not that much activity. It's basically it's like a lecture, isn't it, Kelly? It's like a 5-hour lecture with a 10-minute break. And
Okay, I must comment on that, but yeah, carry on. I'll comment
you're being
afterwards.
flooded. You're being flooded incessantly with information that is pulling together these universal laws. So it's philosophy, it's theology, it's mysticism, and then there's physics thrown in to give it credibility. And then there's sort of lots of non sequiturs pulling together the psychology, the mysticism, and the physics, which at the time you don't realize because it's driving up your dopamine because there's so much novelty in it. So novelty is the first thing, along with flooding, that causes dopamine and stress before you even get into using the exercises. But that first 5 hours frames the worldview or the doctrine to then enable you to believe. It primes you for the end result you're going to get later in the day after using the stressful exercises. And so it's done very cleverly to get you to believe that a certain outcome has occurred because of X, when in actual fact it might be this mechanistic Y that we are discussing. But it's interesting that the whole thing is getting you deeper into the older brain structures rather than the neocortex and the executive center.
Yeah. Is the word quantum used at all during
Yeah.
those 5
The whole
hours?
thing
It's
is based on that.
it. The whole thing.
Yeah,
We
I
have
mean,
quantum realms, quantum fields, quantum entanglement.
Yeah,
Yeah.
Method
I
that we
mean,
use, which has currently
Mhm.
has a certain name,
Mhm.
used to be called something with the word quantum in it.
Yeah.
So yeah, it's very much quantum oriented, and there's no way you can gauge whether anything going on in the brain has likeness to quantum physics. So the non sequiturs and logical bridges are very dubious. Somehow it's very easy for everybody to buy into that, presumably because the dopamine is going up, which gives you access to that interconnected magisterial universe that you couldn't previously imagine with the level of normal brain chemistry that you had.
So this is where the sort of social psychology side comes into it, or the maybe a bit of kind of cognitive psychology. So in my view, anytime you hear something being motivated with quantum mechanics or quantum physics, it's a very good sign that the person is trying to BS you. I mean, Richard Feynman said anyone who says that they understand quantum mechanics doesn't understand quantum mechanics. I mean, it's an incredibly difficult thing, but it's often used as, because it's so difficult to understand, it can be used to pretty much motivate anything because nobody can really understand what it is. So it's often misused. And without speaking about dopamine or any of those sorts of things, um, you know, I speak quite a lot about the elaboration likelihood model in terms of a way of persuading people of various things. If you're trying to convince somebody of something, the ELM or elaboration likelihood model basically says you can either use the central route or the peripheral route. So the central route is you give the person the information that they need, but you give it to them slowly, you give it to them in a simple form, and you give them all the information that's required for them to make a decision about whatever you're trying to convince them. And you also say to them, you are smart enough to understand this, and it's important that you look through the evidence and you understand. So go away, take your time, speak to whoever you need to, and you know, decide whether you believe this or not. So that's the central route. The peripheral route is using shortcuts or heuristics. You convince the person to believe something based on this great authority figure said it, or because they feel really good or whatever. And there's certain things that make it more likely that a person is going to look at all the evidence. And if a person lacks the motivation or the ability to look through all the evidence, they're more likely to rely on shortcuts. So you've just said that there was a 5-hour thing that you just overloaded with information. They're speaking about quantum this and whatever. So the average person in that situation is going to be like, okay, I don't really have the ability to process everything that's been given to me. I'm going to just trust this person in front of me who seems to really know what they're talking about. And I might just take on the conclusions that they're giving me rather than actually understanding the way that they got there. And again, if it involves quantum mechanics, are you going to go and learn about quantum mechanics and understand it perfectly? Or are you going to just accept that this really smart sounding person knows what they're talking about? And maybe you look around the room and you sort of see that everyone else also seems to be kind of buying into it. And you're like, okay, well, I'm going to take these things on. So you're 100% right. They might be saying that they're trying to elevate, the executive side of things and being very cognitive and understanding. But the very fact that they've used a 5-hour process with a 10-minute break means that your ability and your motivation to think through all the evidence is obliterated. There's no way that the average person is going to be able to process that amount of information. So it makes it far more likely that you'll rely on peripheral cues.
Great point. Definitely. And just a quick rundown. I think I looked through the first training manual from the first course I went to. There were over 25, 30 new names that I wrote down and misspelled. Einstein's mentioned, and then you've got Plato, Aristotle, Heraclitus, Parmenides, William James, Henry James, Schrodinger,
Yeah.
Schopenhauer, Heisenberg. They're all
Richard
in
Feynman.
there, reeled off, and it's like you say, tis the heuristic that
Yeah.
he's quoting all of these amazing names and linking all their ideas together. So there must be something in it. You look around the room during that 5-hour period, and you'll see quite a few people have nodded off.
Yeah.
You know,
And I mean, exactly. And that's the appeal to authority. It's, again, Einstein associated obviously with being very smart. If he has said something, then you kind of like, okay, I don't need to look into all of that myself. If he is supporting it, then I'm going to accept that it's true. And I don't have the motivation and ability to go and understand it all myself.
Yeah.
So, yeah,
Yeah. And I think by the end of the seminar, there's another social psychology element to this that I learned about recently, which is the idea of uncommon commonality, which is that as humans, we have a need to be distinct individuals, but we also have a need to belong in communities and groups. And when you're in that LGAT, certainly after a couple of days, 3 days, once you've had that high dopamine manic sort of episode, you feel connected to everybody who's having those experiences. You now feel part of a group that has there's a little bit of smug superiority about
for
it.
sure.
We
Yeah,
know a little
yeah,
bit more than the average person now. And so
yeah,
you're in that group. You've got a commonality within that group, but it's uncommon in society as a whole. Also known as the theory of optimal distinctiveness, I think it's called, where
yeah.
we are optimally distinct from the rest of society, but we are part of a group. So I get all my needs met, Maslow's needs met as a result of that.
Absolutely. And I mean, as people, we tend to identify with kind of groups that we belong to. And I mean, there's a very well-known theory within psychology is social identity theory. So this is the idea that we get a lot of sort of self-esteem from the groups that we belong to, and we tend to, as a result of that, unconsciously overvalue the characteristics of the in-group and devalue the characteristics of the out group, whatever that might be. And so in the context of whatever seminar group that you've taken part in, the in group becomes this group of people that have the shared experience with you and the shared knowledge or understanding. And the out group are people that don't know about it. And often you hear from people that have taken part in LGATs, and they'll say it's been great and I've learned so much and I've become a better person, etc. And then you speak to people that they know, and the people that they know don't necessarily agree with that. They kind of feel like they became a bit smug, or they became like they knew something that everyone else didn't, and that only people in the group were part of this wonderful thing, and people that were outside were kind of made to feel like they were missing out on something, or that they were lesser in some way.
Yeah.
So yeah.
Yeah, and I think that's evidenced in. Have you read Rick Ross's book on cults at all?
I've read a lot of his stuff, but I haven't actually got his book. Yeah.
Okay, because there are a number of chapters near the end on interventions to try and get people out of these different types of groups, and there is one documented for LGATs, and it's actually a medical
Okay.
doctor. A medical doctor was in a particular LGAT. I won't mention which one it was, but
Yeah.
all his colleagues had noticed a change for the negative in his personality and behavior and the way he
Yeah.
was treating other people. His wife and kids had noticed the negative change. He thought he was only moving in the right direction with great positivity till they took him through the kind of extraction process, at which point he sat there in silence and eventually agreed never to go back. So with the right
Yeah.
line of questioning, he was brought back down to earth again, and that saved his marriage. And so
Yeah.
it's fascinating how we do end up in that little, it's like an ego tunnel or a group.
Yeah.
We think we're amazing. We kind of have this special knowledge or special ability now. We've been through these processes, and actually, a lot of other people are looking at us thinking, turned into a bit of a dick.
Yeah. I think that's something that's been noticed quite a lot, is that, yeah, people that have gone through think that it's made them into much better versions of themselves. And then people that they interact with aren't necessarily always in agreement.
Yeah, that I found that in myself. I know Kelly will speak about this as well. That narrowed my social circle significantly. And one of the things that triggered me and got me to really jolt out of this back in March was a friend of mine had his 50th birthday party. And I got to hang out with people I used to hang out with a lot, and then almost distanced myself from over the 10 years I was involved with this organization. And suddenly it dawned on me how great it was to hang out with these people. Then the horror comes. What the hell have I been doing for the last 10 years? And sort of like, it's like a big slap in the face. And yeah, crikey, this is something going on here that's not me, that's not quite right. And then the nervous system shit kicks in, and you have a little bit of a PTSD response. And I think Kelly can speak to that more than I can. But yeah, it's tough when you suddenly realize that you have been indoctrinated. There's been some thought reform. You have had a dogma or a doctrine implanted in your psyche that might not quite be reality. And yet you've been running around in your life thinking you're some kind of superior person. That's not
Yeah.
good. brain chemistry when that happens.
Yeah, I mean, I think, and this is again something that I speak about. I mean, I kind of run through a sort of high level neuroscience thing, but the social psychology of LGATs is very interesting as well. And so there are various books that have been written on persuasion, and one of them is one called Influence by Robert Cialdini, and he speaks about commitment and consistency. And commitment is basically behavior, and then once you've behaved in a particular way, you want to keep thinking and behaving in a way that is in line with what you've done before, because it can be very uncomfortable to kind of acknowledge that maybe your behavior wasn't right. And another book called The Wisest One in the Room by Thomas Gilovich and Lee Ross, social psychologists, they kind of say that one of the most sort of amazing findings from the past couple of decades in the social sciences that people's behavior is a better predictor of their thinking than their thinking is of their behavior. So if you can get people to behave in a particular way, then it's hard for them to undo that behavior. So they often just change their thinking so that it's in line, because they don't like that kind of dissonance. So in LGATs, what they tend to do is they get participants who have graduated to recruit new people. And once you've recruited somebody else, it's very hard to undo that. So it also makes it very difficult for you to start thinking, oh, maybe there was a problem with that. And so, I mean, you can think about it in religious context as well. I mean, if you've, I came from a Christian background. If you've been praying and you've been doing various things and you've been tithing, I mean, not that that's a terrible thing, or if you've been speaking in tongues or something, if you suddenly start to think, well, maybe, God's not there or whatever, then you've got to start thinking about everything that you were doing and how weird it is or strange it is to kind of acknowledge that. It's a bit like, people that are in a relationship and maybe they start suspecting that their partner's been unfaithful. The pain of acknowledging that is so big that people might be able to look past all of these indicators, these clear signals of things that are going on, because as soon as they actually acknowledge that, it means that they've got to deal with all of these other things. And so it's easier to kind of just rationalize and keep going. And I think it's very similar for people that are involved in groups to kind of be like, okay, that does seem weird, that does seem problematic, that doesn't really align with reality. But if I acknowledge that these things are not right, it means that the last 5, 10 years, 20 years, whatever it is of my life has been doing something that maybe I shouldn't have been doing. And that is more painful. So yeah, it is. It's a very difficult thing to acknowledge.
Yeah. Or just on that, I was going to drive my business forward based on a lot of these teachings. And I think something held me back from doing that. But I would have had to have backtracked on myself and said, actually, all this stuff that I've taught you in my training academy, I don't believe in this anymore. And having taken money from people and then saying, actually, I've changed my mind is precisely
Exactly.
an example of what you're saying there. Thank goodness I didn't.
Yeah.
Yes, that
Kelly, you disappeared then
element.
for a minute. Did you have a...
I did. My internet dropped out, so I've just patched into my phone and come back on. So yes, so I missed a little bit of that conversation, but anyhow, I'm back. Disappeared into the ether. I was probably not meant to hear something.
Good.
I just caught the tail end of that, but
I thought maybe, and I was just going to say, we're just talking about the challenge of once you've been involved with something for a long time, how difficult it is to acknowledge that maybe you were wrong about it. And sort of the more that you've done in terms of committing, in terms of particularly public commitments. So people have seen you involved, maybe conversations you've had with people, you've invited friends, family to get involved in the organization. The more of that sort of thing that you've done, the more difficult it becomes for you to acknowledge that maybe there's a problem with it and to, yeah.
Well, I can speak from direct experience with that because I was involved with this organization for 18 years and it was a lot of my life and it was integrated into the businesses that I had and I was also using it professionally as well. And coming to the realization that it wasn't all cracked up to what I thought it was incredibly painful.
Yeah.
It was incredibly difficult to experience and to process. And to be honest, like, I will say that I'm not fully through that and still in the recovery process with professionals, 2 different professionals, one a trauma specialist and somebody that specializes in coercive control and cultic systems is also helping me to come to understand what had occurred for me. But yeah, I can definitely see that and empathize with those that may be sitting on the fence with a decision with that. It is incredibly difficult. And for me, it was a line in the sand that I couldn't actually, go back. Once I'd actually seen and heard and experienced something that I'm not prepared to talk about on here at the moment. I couldn't go back. I couldn't. And it was coming into that healing process with licensed professionals that have a deep understanding of what you're actually talking about. And so, that's why I'm really grateful for your work, because it has helped me come to understand the process of getting into it, and then being able to see it inside of the large group awareness training seminars. And I did a lot of those every year, every month. And it is
Yeah.
definitely the patternicity that you see then. You talk about all of the things like David, you were talking about the flooding process in the morning. That's just the first program. And then we have the next program, which is a longer program, which starts at 7 o'clock in the morning and goes till 10 o'clock at night with multitudes of information. And then the next program, which is even deeper and deeper and deeper again. So there was a lot to unpack. It is a lot to process for myself in that. But also, too, the biggest thing you
Yeah.
touched on, the social psychology, the social community aspect, it basically became my family. And that also, too, was knowing that I would have to disconnect from that. And this is what I found the most difficult to work through, is because we were taught everything was unconditional love. There seemed to be not that when this happened, when I started to question, etc. It was the
Yeah.
ostracization and pushed to the outside, and the scapegoating, and all of the things that go with that. That was probably the most difficult of grieving. But yet, then we had to
Yeah.
I don't know if you're going to speak to that, Dave, like the other process that we had around the grieving process. It just seemed that every angle was covered for you not to have any form of emotionality or any form of polarization in your psyche. Any direction you could go to, you could bring that back to a place of center. So it was very difficult for me to let that go because of the super ego interjects that were happening in my mind, and to experience, because they were so strong, so strong. It was just natural habit to do that. Like it was like an addiction, I suppose. I had to go through a detox in that.
Yeah, you're almost, I think it almost makes you non-human to go through this work, because if you are dissolving emotional charges due to polarized judgments, and you feel you have to keep doing that over and over and over again because that makes you more human somehow. It goes back to the idea of Plato and Aristotle with Plato's charioteers, and then Aristotle's idea that the rational mind is superior to the emotional reactive mind, which is a theme in
Yeah.
Scientology as well. This theme
I
is,
was just thinking that the reactive mind, yeah.
yeah, it's L. Ron Hubbard down to a T, really. And again, when you start to see that this has been present in other organizations for a long time, you start to wonder, where has this particular leader got everything from? It's just chunked it all together from various other things he's done or read. Now, if you get rid of your emotions, because they are so-called animal nature of your humanity, rather than this perfected rational mind that has mathematical balance and
Yeah.
equilibrium, you're not living life on earth anymore. You're trying to find some kind of transcendent perfection that only the gods can have. And that seems to me to be a pretty delusional, unrealistic expectation. And
And you can't do it either. I mean, so
exactly.
reasoning involves the affective or emotional elements as well. It seems like a lot of these people have kind of taken an idea and just applied really kind of dumb logic to it. It's almost like having one beer makes me feel more relaxed, so surely having 20 beers will be like great. Like that's almost the thinking that's applied, because if you can have distorted thinking if you're very emotional. So if emotions are totally dominating, that can be a problem. And I mean, Daniel Kahneman, in terms of thinking fast and slow, the idea that emotions or system one thinking can be problematic is a totally valid idea. So maybe reducing the effects of emotion can be great, but getting rid of it altogether is a problem. And in a very similar way, the idea of reframing, which is really just, a kind of form of cognitive restructuring that you see in cognitive therapy, that's a good idea as well. So saying to somebody, if you alter the way that you think about this, it may have less of an emotional impact on you, and it may allow you to see it in a more positive light. That's a good thing to do. But to say to somebody that's been raped that it's just because of the way that they're thinking about it that's causing the negative effect, which happens in LGAT sometimes, that's just extreme. That's like saying have 20 beers, that's better than having one beer. It's taking an idea that's useful when applied correctly and stretching the thinking so far that it becomes problematic. So I think that's why you do see these ideas in multiple organizations, but it's non-professionals that are applying them. And so they're being applied irresponsibly and in ways that can actually cause more damage than good.
There's an interesting concept in that I experienced was the reduction of an experience. So, we may have a label, we use the word rape as such, but then there was a reduction of what was made up of a subset of traits. And so therefore we had to reduce everything down to the parts that the label or the experience was. And for example, I remember working with a young girl that had been in a DV relationship and her partner was stalking her. So we couldn't use the word stalking. We had to reduce it down to the actions that the person was doing. And what it came down to is he just placed a note on her car, on the windscreen of her car. And then it was then to ask the other question, well, how did that help you? So it was just taking it away from the full context of the experience to the broken down to the part. Then each part was actually worked in that format. So that in itself dehumanizes the experience. I experienced that.
Yeah, I mean, it's ultimately gaslighting. I mean, that's very similar to the idea of, oh, they were just, they weren't harassing you, they were supporting you. But I mean, they could have said they weren't harassing you. There was a phone call and they were, you could have broken it down into those smaller elements, but we've got to make sense of things in our life. And sometimes we can make sense problematically. So, if you are in an interaction with somebody and they smile at you and they are genuinely trying to be friendly and you interpret that as harassment, then sure, let's have a conversation about that. But if somebody's making a reasonable inference about something that somebody did, and you kind of say that inference that you made is actually not right, here's my interpretation of it, or maybe there shouldn't be any interpretation, then that becomes problematic. It can be used as a tool for manipulation, which it seems like it often is in these environments.
It was also nested with
It's an arbitrary level on which to focus.
and nested with the colloquialism of there are no victims. There are only lessons. So
yeah.
So I mean, every angle was actually covered in our experiences.
Well, you are ultimately responsible. Also, something you see in Scientology. Yeah.
Yeah. In Scientology, it's called pulling it in. They call it pulling it in. You are responsible for what happens in your life. You have pulled it in. I think we can talk about the Nexium because they're long gone now, and Ranieri's in jail. In their language, it was called being at cause. And in the group we were in, it's how have you attracted it? And so it's exactly the same principle, different language, all going back at least as far as Scientology.
Wow, what an interesting conversation, guys. I'm sure that we could do a part 2 on this and go a lot deeper. So final thoughts, Dave, final thoughts.
Yeah, I'm just thrilled that although as you said earlier, John, your work is a working theory at the moment. I don't think you can, it may not be precise, but I don't think it can be dismissed. It can't be ignored, particularly because you've drawn on such a wide range of source materials, and quite a lot of it I was familiar with already. I just hadn't connected the dots. When we are in these groups, there is a mechanistic rationale that explains how they all operate without needing to speak to any mysticism. It doesn't close the door to mysticism, but let's start with the neuroscience first and then go from there, because I think the neuroscience helps us to explain the potential downsides as well as the upsides that people have as well.
Yeah, from my side, Kelly and Dave, I mean, I just appreciate the chance to speak with you, and I appreciate what you're doing. I mean, in 2010, when I went through one of these things, I had no background in psychology. I was just kind of confused and, quite angry about what I'd been put through, and it was very difficult to speak to anyone about what was going on. It's so nice to see that there are these podcasts, that people are having these conversations, and that information is getting out there, and that people are starting to kind of question, and yeah, it's really helpful. I think initially it was just on Rick Ross's site. There was a section, large group awareness trainings, and anonymous people would kind of post what they'd been through, whereas now there are a lot more people that are starting to realize that these seminars and these groups are connected with each other. And so it's not just some isolated experience that they've gone through, that there's really a community of people that have been through various similar things, and that there are some answers to the questions, although I think there's still a lot to be done.
And then just to recap that, in understanding the patternicity for our listeners to, if they are going into these personal development or human potential or self-help seminars, like let's recap the patternicity that they may experience in there, that they should potentially have red flags for or question within themselves. Would you like to do that, John?
Yeah, sure. And I mean, I'm less familiar with your organization than with others. So I mean, there are a lot that are very similar to each other. So my research is kind of focused on those. So I would say if you're invited by a family member, friend, or maybe through work, if they refuse to tell you anything about what the seminar is going to involve, but they say that it's life-changing or transformative, or you just need to do it and trust them, that's a big red flag. If you hear the terminology, there are things that you know that you know. There are things that you know that you don't know, but there are things that you don't know that you don't know. And the seminar is about the last group of things. That's a pretty good indicator. If it lasts for 3 to 4 days, the initial seminar, if the hours are very long, that's a problem. Yeah, I mean, and I think if they can't give you if they can't give you an outline of what the seminar is about, and they kind of say it's about a transformative experience, then that's a big.
I just want to ask, and if you ask a question, what are the downsides of this, and it's not answered, would that be a flag as well?
Yeah, I mean, I would say that that's a red flag. I mean, I'd also say that the vast majority of people, to be fair, probably participate in like one seminar, maybe 2 seminars, and then leave the organization and don't stick around for very long. And it may do no real harm. If they're pushed into sort of a hypermanic, mildly elevated state, they feel transformed. It might be a catalyst for them making some positive changes in their lives. I think that the thing that people often don't see is that some people participate and it causes real problems. They make impulsive decisions. They give money away. They make business decisions that are problematic. Maybe they get divorced immediately afterwards. And they can do things that really wreck their lives. And then they often are unaware that it was because of this process that's why they did those things. And so then they can blame themselves for being, irresponsible, whereas they don't realize that it was actually a lot to do with the organization. And they've often been convinced that they're totally responsible for everything. So yeah, I think if there isn't an acknowledgement that there are risks, then yeah, that's a good indicator as well.
Well, thank you. I really do appreciate your research and the things that you have written. It helped me extensively, and I want to thank you for coming onto the podcast, and you too, Dave, for supporting me and and co-hosting this episode. And one thing I want to say to our listeners is to really seek safely when you are going into these environments. Ask yourself the question, if you are becoming dependent on any one method, is this safe for me to be doing so? And just have the awareness, if you ask questions to the group leader and they're not answered, or you are shut down, or they're deflected, that is an indication that that is a red flag. So listen to your body, listen to your feelings, listen to your instincts and your intuition, because they are there to really guide you. So it is part of my journey now to actually bring this awareness to people who are entering these spaces to do it safely. So thank you, John, and thank you, Dave. And where can people get your book?
Cheers. It's on
From
Amazon.com.
Amazon?
I mean, I'm actually kind of jealous because it's hard to get it in South Africa. They don't really deliver in South Africa. If you're in the UK or Australia, you can actually get a hard copy. I've got to have them shipped. It costs me way more than a book should cost to get a hard copy of my own books.
Well, it's well worth reading. It's well worth purchasing. So, and where can people actually reach you? We'll put all your details in the show notes, so they wanted to reach out.
Yeah, sure. So actually, all of my information, the podcasts that I've done, that sort of thing, you can find on my website. So it's johnhunterphd.com. And there's a link for the book there as well. Yeah.
Perfect. I must say, it was actually quite difficult to get in Australia too as well.
Great.
But I found it. Dave got it the next day or something when he,
Okay.
yeah. And Dave, where can people reach you? And Dave, where can people reach you?
I'm in between websites at the moment.
Just on Instagram?
I'm just in between websites. So yeah, just Instagram or Facebook for now, and then we'll let everybody know when the new website's up.
Perfect. Well, thank you guys. I really do appreciate it, and great conversation, and looking forward to the next one. So thank you to everybody for listening, and we will see you on the next one.